Today our guest is Will Bruder, an architect and artist from the Arizona desert area. Welcome to our campus.
Oh, thank you very much.
You've demonstrated a finesse in architectural design through a wide variety of building types ranging from residences to libraries. You're also a self-taught architect. Where and when did your training begin?
Well, I originally come from the Midwest. I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And a lot of the roots that anybody gains, I think, towards who they will become happen at very early periods in their life. And for me, it was an early period of sandboxes and erector sets and Lincoln logs. A great fifth grade teacher, Miss Tim, I still remember, that sort of introduced one to the ideas of nature and sort of civic space and things like this, a very memorable character. And then from that, it really is sort of grounded in something that Detroit's all about, which is the automobile, because I'm 49, and back when I was in high school, the Fisher Body competitions to design cars, which sort of postdated the coach models that were built, was a fascination, and I came to Detroit as a winner in that program and went to the Tech Center in Warren, Michigan, and then I proceeded to spend a brief period of time at GMI in Flint, and found that the values of industry as I perceived it in the late 60s weren't where I wanted to be, and so architecture became sort of my next destiny. And the lack of traditional focus was again by good fortune or fate. I was accepted at IIT in Chicago to study formally, and yet the summer of 1965 I worked in a really wonderful studio of 5 people that were really on the edge of their creativity, and I ended up pounding nails nights and doing things. And so the end of summer came, and I opted to continue my work effort almost on a full-time basis and then formulate my own education in a fine arts program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And that went around the basis of fine art and philosophy and all the arts. It included engineering under a School of Engineering, architectural history under an art history program, and urban planning. And I had more credits in sculpture when all was said and done, and that's how the sculpture came into it. But it's a very important thing for me. I think that the sort of the broader overview of the arts and putting architecture into the context of a greater art and fine art context, I think, was very important and very critical to who I think I've become at one level.
And beyond the BFA, you had actually even more construction experience when you worked with Paolo Soleri then.
Right. During that period of time, I continued to work pretty well full-time while I was going through school, and then moonlighted construction locally in the Midwest. But in 1967, there was this man named Paolo Soleri, who was a visionary, that worked from the desert, and he came to lecture at Milwaukee, and I was infatuated with the concepts and the ideas of what it represented. He was running workshops and construction literally on his desert site of his studio. And so in '67, I was a student for the summer in the desert and worked concrete and silt casting and earth casting, and I followed that up right upon being married in January of 1968, sort of drove right from the service to spend 8 months with Paolo doing drawings on his archaeology ideas, which is a combination of cities and nature that would sort of predated the interest in that, and then worked in construction and also poured bronze in his foundry.
So what specifically do you find about Paolo Soleri that relates to the things you do now, how you handle architecture, how you perceive architecture now?
Well, there's 2 major things that really are my legacy from Paolo I focus on, and one is that from the experience of making things in the studios of Paolo and observing him as a man, there was a humble austerity, always a frugality about means to create his ideas. And so everything had a budget agenda, had this, there was never any money to build anything. And so you had to be very inventive and reinvent and reinvestigate even the simplest material to create the forms and ideas that Paolo was interested in. And I think that's something that we always have to bring to architecture in today's times as well as then. A budget is always a critical issue, and what you can do with the common and the little is so important. The other thing that was so important with influences me from Paolo is the whole idea of really thinking about concepts and big ideas. There's a greater sense of community as well as the object that Paolo brings to all his thinking. So while many of your viewers might know of Paolo Soleri not so much as the visionary, but the bell maker, the man that makes the wonderful bronze and ceramic bells, those are sort of the polar extensions of what his concern as an artist is. And I, again, like to think about the micro and the macro. They're always part of an architectural happening for me.
I think another observation on Paolo Soleri, and you probably experienced this, is the fact that his studio was, in a sense, also a lab. His architecture was his own personal vision, which he also financed himself. So that's an interesting way of running an architectural design studio, in a sense.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I think that the idea of experimentation and reaching always is, no matter if they're real projects or visionary, it's always having that rigor in yourself to reinvestigate, you know, ways of doing things, potentials of things, and I do carry that through. And when I first started, I was in the 70s when I opened my own studio. I finished my apprenticeship here in Michigan with Gunnar Birkerts over in Birmingham, so I spent a year there. Wandered the grounds of Cranbrook, and so, you know, Detroit's a very important sort of home base at one level for a formative period of my life. But when I went back to the desert, I had a couple of years to finish apprenticeship. I then passed my professional examinations the same time as somebody with a traditional education by coincidence. Opened my own studio, and I opened that with sort of nail apron and the skill saw in hand, and my first works were about owner-builder. It was very hands-on. I would not only do models and design concepts for my patio and remodel clients, but I would arrive on the site on weekends and pound nails, and sort of, it would be this sort of cooperative effort where we build things together. And so it went from an owner-builder sort of basis, and that was in the 70s, and then it evolved into more of a contract management situation where we still weren't working with traditional means to build our buildings, but professional craftsmen had been brought to the mix because the projects were getting larger. There was this other complexity to things, and yet we were serving both, wearing an architect hat as well as a construction manager hat, overseeing the management of the construction, the scheduling, bringing the forces together, overseeing the budgets. And it became a really productive way to do the kind of work that I like to do. The owner got more for their dollar, and I've got more architecture for the dollar as well. And so everybody was a winner under that agenda. You know, the 90s have become, again, another different reinvention, and I think that it's very important as both a practitioner and a student of architecture always to realize there's never a finality. There's always, every day is about discovery and about things you don't know, and trying to find out answers to those, which then reveals other things you don't know, and it's this constant search. I think, you know, I never had a formal degree in architecture, and again, I think that formal degree can become dangerous to a person because it gives them a sense of some sort of finality. It's just a marker, a chapter in a book, not the book in itself. Right. And we have to keep reaching and growing and learning.
Now, you mentioned Gunnar Birkerts. What kind of experience did you have there? What did you work on? What did you learn from him?
Well, as some of you might know, Gunnar is a student of the Saarinen process. He worked with Eero Saarinen originally when he came to this country. And again, there was a process of architecture about really pragmatism and program that was tied then to the poetry of visions and concepts of architecture. And so being part of that methodology and that energy was very crucial and very important. You know, Gunnar and I have really been sort of an oil and water relationship over time that's been interesting, and yet I had lunch with him today, and it has become more sort of a peer and yet father-son sort of relationship, which was very curious, and I'm very, very happy about, because a formative period, there's so much that we gain from every life experience, and I look back now at what that simple year meant in everything from sketch to technique to thinking about light and other things. I can see roots in that experience because, you know, Gunnar was an artist that lived true to his integrity throughout his life, and that was a very good role model that way. You know, physically, my year was primarily focused on being the designer working with Gunnar on the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, Texas, so it was an interesting experience that way. And yet it was a
So you were a designer primarily?
Primarily, but I did working drawings. It was a full mix. I asked Gunnar for that, and he shared that. So I did working drawings as much as I did design. And so it was about making what we were dreaming about as well as just, you know, creating the dreams and the models. So it was a good year. It was a good sort of graduate work at one level.
You've developed a simple architectural philosophy which states architecture is the celebration of the art of listening. How does this affect your architecture? Where did that come from?
Well, that little phrase came from a graduation talk I gave in San Diego a number of years ago. And it started to be sort of the idea that I have a firm belief that, you know, we are because of our clients, not, you know, they're the reason we do things. They're the reason we have the opportunities to do things. And listening to them is what we gain the greatest freedom and empowerment from. And so the act of programming is probably the most important creative act that you do as an architect. possibly in the whole process. Because if you listen well and you form a translation and editing, if you can take your client's needs, client meaning an individual for a house or a community for a library, and listen to what that's really about, and translate and edit and create ideas that give that structure and organization, chances are that no matter how weird your scheme might be or seem or appear on the outside to the uninformed, if you have attached it to what the ideals and the what you've gotten from this listening process, it's going to be bought, it's going to be accepted, because it becomes a manifestation of your client. And bottom line, that's what a client wants. They want to be represented in both their ordinary needs and the things that they can't put any formwork on. And so that's where the idea started, was a simple notion of the client.
The listening.
The listening. And then I started thinking about, now, wait a second. We listen to site, we listen to climate, we listen to context, we listen to history, we listen to the craftsman. And again, an architect, it's really important for an architect to listen to the craftsman. When we go into the field, when we are building our ideas, there shouldn't be this blind arrogance that I drew it, so it's so. Again, it's this dialogue of understanding first the materials which you must have, and really know what the tools can do, what the integrity of the materiality is. But then when you get out in the dirt, and there is a guy standing there over some concrete forms, and you're talking about placing concrete, you talk about what you want to achieve, and a lot of times he'll have a way that's 10 times easier, and it'll get you the same exact effect. I think it's all about those opportunities that make something come alive. I've found over time it's interesting because a lot of my work is very spontaneous at site. We do very good documentation, which is crucial, both in drawings and specifications, and yet I always keep the door open for opportunity. An opportunity is, again, what you experience when the reality sets in, and again, being responsible enough to change both for good things or bad that might be out there that you observe as evolution. And also, sometimes you go and there's a mistake, and, we're all human. Could be your mistake, could be the craftsman's mistake. Okay, but then it's what you do with the mistake. How does that turn into another opportunity to re-edit and whatever? There might be the time, well, the mistake is corrected with a jackhammer. That's normally the best way to repair a mistake in concrete. There aren't too many things that can be done because, again, my architecture celebrates sort of the integrity of the process of concrete and what the materiality is.
And Goff used to say that, he used to refer to happy accidents.
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. And again, Goff, another mentor of mine. And Goff really was the man that gave me the sensibility about listening. There was no architect that listened better than a client than Bruce Goff. He was truly the architect, the client's architect. And all these very macabre, almost to some people's eyes, constructs that he made were celebrations of client. Whether it be a family that collected glass as a hobby and he created beautiful glass bay windows, on every level. He was the ultimate person and had an energy and a passion about architecture, which again can be learned from.
And listening isn't always something that you hear with your ears. Listening is maybe going beyond that and trying to determine what the client really needs. Sometimes what they say is one thing,
it's not literal.
Sometimes what
Yes.
they need is sort of out in another area.
Yeah,
because listening is complicated.
Very complicated, because again, that's a very good point, because listening can be misinterpreted very quickly to be a literal listen. I tell you I want 3 arches and a mansard roof. That's what you will get. I tell you I want brick. I tell you I want this or that. And again, you have to, as an artist and an architect and a person of thought and reason, reach farther than that. That's the easy answer. Again, an architect needs to develop sort of a bond of communication with a client that is of total trust and faith, and a really responsible sort of dialogue, such that, the questioning process is, they're abstract ideas, like you might say, what is a front door for a residence? Okay, what is a door? Is it solid? Is it translucent? Is it transparent? Is it made of steel? Is it made of wood? Is it made of concrete? The question becomes, what is a front door to you coming home at night? Mm-hmm. What is a front door to a friend or a family member coming to visit you? And what is your front door to a stranger? So it's in those kind of questions that you keep extending the bounds, right. Keep reaching out.
You spoke a little bit earlier about craftsmanship and building with one's hands. I remember reading an article somewhere where you talk about the craft of building and that it's not necessarily typical of contemporary architecture. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think that craftsmanship in the late 20th century is tied all too often to, again, budgets we use then as an excuse limits craftsmanship or the ability to craft. A lack of understanding and, again, a world of faux materials makes craftsmanship another sort of issue, materials pretending to be not what they are. But when you get to really the basics, I mean, we sit in a room here that's, beautiful sort of fired brick that's common to the region. I mean, Detroit is a brick city. I mean, it has a masonry tradition about it. We look at the timber and the wood frame yet, and again, as part of a building of contemporary architecture and homes and buildings for many people. And, we think about what this is, and architects all too often will take the easy way out for themselves and say, well, the craftsman is dead. We can't do craft anymore. We just have to think in these more generic sort of production sort of ideas. And to that, I really am in total disagreement, because there is a craftsman ethic in every community that I've ever been in and lived in and seen and visited. And you find architects working on the edges of all these communities and builders and craftsmen that come together. They have the ability. They are not pushed or tested nearly enough. And there is a great pride ethic in our country. And so I feel the craft can be alive. It becomes the knowledge of the architect to draw out the best of the craftsman and offer a logical path that isn't contrary, that knows about what the tools are, what the materials can do, to gain the respect and competence of the craftsman. And then I think we can see a much richer architecture. And I really think that's happening in architecture. I'm very optimistic where architecture is going right now.
But many times budget seems to control, craftsmanship.
No, it doesn't
which
control
direction?
no, it doesn't control craftsmanship.
Okay.
It controls choice of material and choice of process. Okay, what one has to do is
attitude then.
Yeah, it's attitude. It's very much attitude, but it's also the physical reality. I mean, craftsmanship doesn't, have to be. That's not necessarily about, detail and intensity. It could be very simple. It's a simple joint. It's a simple door casing. It's a simple laying of a brick wall and the joinery, etc. And within that context, my work is always driven by literally no money. I mean, we had less than $100 to do the new Central Library in Phoenix a square foot, which is a pretty unbelievable budget in the late 20th century for a major complicated cultural building. But we got to that by craftsmanship dealing with a skin of copper, not hand wrought, but rolled on presses that made grain elevator siding. Okay, the craft became then the modularity of that panel, the preparation, the transparency of it, the fastening of stainless steel screws and how they were applied. And all these resulted in this crafted object like nothing you'll ever see. But again, driven by budget, we did the skin of copper for this new library for $1 more a square foot than a conventional stucco wall. So again, it's this craft and understanding and building. And I think, again, there's just, when we craft things, there's a uniqueness in craft that really is a celebration of a humanity. And I think if we can get humanism back into the environments we build, they become much more about people and about comfort and about shelter and raise levels that appeal to us sensually as well as intellectually.
Do you find personally that it's important to be on a site as the building is constructed to examine the craftsmanship or encourage the craftsmanship to occur?
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's an energy that you bring to a site as an architect. I mean, there's an excitement. This just doesn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, the presence, and I mean, it's, that's one of the biggest investment of time that you put in. I mean, the work totally comes alive at that phase. I mean, you do documents, you do things, but they have a certain sterileness about them at times. And again, you have to empower the craftsman with your passion, with your understanding, with your willingness to listen, and again, discover the opportunities. And, I just can't believe it. I mean, I've been in buildings of Frank Lloyd Wright's that he never stepped on the site, either to see the site, or I've been in Frank Lloyd Wright buildings that Wright never stood in. And that's pretty shocking.
Yeah.
And here's a very great architect doing very wonderful work, and these are fine works, and he did send his apprentices out. But I can't relate to that. I mean, it just is, it's totally foreign.
You've traveled extensively abroad, which we've mentioned before previously, especially Finland? Where have you been in Europe?
Finland and Italy, all of Europe pretty well, Spain extensively,
How do you
France,
feel about
England.
the issue of craftsmanship in European buildings?
Well, I think that there's obviously a longer historic precedent at one level. I think it's no different than America at one level. I mean, I think that right now there's a greater respect for what is the old or defined as old. Somehow Americans go on holidays and they look at old buildings in Rome and in cities like Bath and Helsinki, et cetera, and with great, my God, it's 400 years old, it's 300 years old, and you consider them precious, right? And somehow driving down Southfield Road in Detroit, they don't have the same attachment to a building that was built 20 years ago, and they should. I mean, there's an important, valuable worth in any structure that man makes. And as you look at remodel work or reconstituting the city or redefining the city, there's a great building inventory of ruins, that are still lived in and some that aren't, that, if you're intelligent, you look at what that worth is, and I think that's what we learn from Europe a lot of times, is because there's a craft overlay there. I mean, there's a tradition, but again, we're basically a European culture in America. I mean, that's where the majority of our craft has come from, and throughout the world, I mean, there's a global regionalism that I think the world is about right now. And regionalism is a new word in architecture, not new the last 25, 30 years, but it's something that we attach to trying to create a personal sense of a place. And I think regionalism has that quality, that it's your neighborhood, it's your city, it's your region. But I think we can't live anymore in that small context because there's interesting repeats. I was at dinner last night with a Chilean architect, in fact, in Boston. And in the course of discussion, we talked about a sort of building culture of row houses that were in Boston. We were having dinner on a pier in Boston in a warehouse environment of houses. And we were talking about there's houses exactly like the houses in Boston that appear in Spain, in Greece, that are fishing culture related, and they track even the English path of some of the explorers. So when you go to the south edge of Chile, here's a similar building vernacular that is regionally appropriate and contextual, related to the materials of the land, be it brick, be it stone, whatever. And so the world is a pretty interesting place, and I think curiosity is important here. I mean, craft and curiosity, maybe that would be a good pairing of two words, because I think to be an architect, it takes an understanding of both, and the spirit of curiosity is one of the givens that you have to have if architectural consequence is going to happen. A student, a client, anybody has to have the spirit of curiosity, I think, to adventure, to really reach, to want something other than the norm.
Right. What about new projects in your office to kind of turn the discussion in another direction here? We haven't talked about anything going on currently in your office, or things that are new.
Yeah. Right now there's about 17, 18 projects in the studio.
What kinds? What kinds of buildings?
It's a wide gamut right now. I'm doing a table for a silent auction for the Art Museum right now that should be finished when I get back to Phoenix. I'm doing a grave marker for an 8-month-old child that recently passed away, which is a very powerful thing to be asked to do. And when I say powerful, I mean it just, it's a very meaningful commission that lots of thought, and we're going to try and have it in place in 3 months when the first anniversary of the child's birth would be. I'm doing, should be going to meet in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I'm just finished a little advertising building up there, which some of you might have seen in one of the recent architectural journals, Progressive Architecture, and I'm currently doing the Teton County Library in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And I'm about to, just in negotiations, getting ready to design a headquarters for a whitewater rafting company, which will be the entry portal for Jackson, which is going to be quite fun. I have homes that I'm designing in Australia on a beach just south of the Great Barrier Reef, in Canmore, Alberta, in Canada. One house called Solstice, one called Equinox, that are about the seasons and about occupation in these two houses. I have a house on the coast of Boston, a retirement home for one of my first clients in Colorado. And there's some big projects and a bunch of other residential things in the desert, so we keep pretty busy.
So you have both work around the Phoenix area and internationally then?
Right now, yeah.
Very good. Now, with the few minutes we have left, is there any particular anecdote that you'd like to tell about any of the projects? Architects always are famous for their wonderful stories.
Right. Well, I guess right now the anecdote might be tied to a funny anecdote that's directly related to Michigan, and we just went by the little bungalow I lived in when I worked with Gunnar Birkerts over in Birmingham. And I remember when we discovered that we were going to be moving to the desert shortly, which was in spring, that we decided that we weren't going to really do too much landscaping at this little bungalow. And yet I'm always really concerned about the landscape's impact to the architecture, and this was just a humble little house we were renting. I think it was $100 a month or $120 was the rent back in 1970, 69 and 70. And so we decided, well, what do we do if we don't want to redo this landscape simply? It's only a lawn, simple house and a lawn. And so I designed a geometric pattern to cut the lawn by. And so I had a power mower, my landlady provided, and we cut geometry into the yard. And it was a combination of this very groomed lawn with grass going to seed, almost like some of the natural habitats that are now more common for yards to accept, of wildflowers and things. And at that time, as liberal as the place was at one level, I remember that a person commuting home from work that took a shortcut off Woodward Avenue called the police on us to complain about this weird landscape program. And I then, in my way sort of standing apart sometimes from the group, found out what the rules were exactly and got a hedge trimmer. And I would trim the tall grass to 10 inches, that it had 2 inches to grow to be legal. And that was a pattern that we went through for about 3 or 4 weeks. So that was a simple, inexpensive architectural design intervention that was made and criticized, and yet became a pattern to live with back then. That was sort of funny. And we used to, go to Cranbrook quite often, and I was late for this interview today because I just had the glorious experience of going to the restored Eel Saarinen residence on the grounds of Cranbrook, and again, a place of great splendor. And at lunch today, Gunnar asked me, what I really wanted to do in architecture yet, what were the real goals, and after being at that house, I guess it's to say, to be as, to be able to create buildings as total and caring as that house. There's a sensuality from the fabrics, from the teapot to the dining table to the bigger idea of garden and how it sits in the environment. And the goals are just to try and sort of focus in on sort of the values that you see in the quality parts of the places we live. I mean, that will always be the goal.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you for being here with us this afternoon. Our guest has been Will Bruder, an architect from the Arizona desert. This interview has been sponsored by the College of Architecture and Design here at Lawrence Technological University.